How you doing, good people? This is Dave Ben Animal. Okay, so 1986, Taito releases this arcade title. Um, it's one of the first games to feature multiple endings. It had about 100 levels in it. Typical, damsel in distress storyline, and it's pretty popular. So about a year or two later, 1988, they released the NES port. And the NES port is wildly successful. So much so that a few years later, a sequel to the NES port is released. But it's the end of the NES life cycle, and that sequel becomes incredibly expensive. The first game, however, it's pretty popular, pretty in demand. It can get expensive depending on the reseller. And it's actually the inspiration for the title of this blog, the name of this blog, rather, because it features two little dinosaur guys, animals, if you will. The game I'm speaking of is Taito's Bubble Bobble. Now, Bubble Bobble, like I said, it's your standard damsel in distress rescue storyline. What makes Bubble Bobble cool is that it had simultaneous two-player gameplay, which was quite the novelty back then. It had multiple endings. Well, two endings, a good ending and a bad ending. And it was single screen, like each level was a single screen, and your character pretty much had one goal in each level, and that's to eliminate the enemy characters on screen. You did so by blowing bubbles, encapsulating them in the enemies in the bubbles, and then stepping on the bubbles or hitting the bubbles in order to burst them and destroy the enemies. The NES version featured a relatively easy password system. It was just 4 characters. Thank you for that, Taito. And it's actually a pretty faithful rendition of the arcade version. Pretty faithful port. That's because the makers of the arcade game actually ported it themselves. There are other ports of Bubble Bobble that are floating out there that are like the Sega Master System version, I believe, that was like 200 levels, and there was a version that was for the BBC Micro that was public domain, and the levels weren't finished. And somewhere in the 90s, Taito lost the original source code for the home port, so they had to send the developer of a compilation disc of a PC board of the arcade game. So there are a lot of really interesting stories involving the different ports of Bubble Bobble, but for my money, the NES version is probably the most faithful rendition of that classic arcade title. You can find it. I got mine at a going out of business sale at a play and trade location, and I got it for $5. But the going rate for it is usually somewhere between. Well, it starts at about $10. I feel like that may be fair considering the quality of the game, but I don't know if I'm willing to pay that much for that title anymore, especially just the cartridge. This has been the 8-Bit Animal, and I will catch you good people tomorrow.